We've heard today about the need to make sure that any solutions we have for our energy future must ensure reliability of our grid and reliability of our supply source. Here to talk about some of those concerns about reliability is Elliott Nethercutt. Elliott is a principal economist at the National Regulatory Research Institute, where he specializes in state and federal energy policy issues. He has also advanced market design enhancements at the California Independent System Operator, developed reliability assessments at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and supported transmission siting efforts and smart grid funding programs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Elliott earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Colorado and has a master's degree in applied economics from the Johns Hopkins University. Elliott, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks to the New Jersey Business and Industry Association for the opportunity to be included in your Decarbonization Summit today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'll tell you a little bit about my organization, NRRI. We are a nonprofit organization that essentially serves as the research branch for NARUC. And for those of you who aren't familiar, NARUC represents the public service commissions across the country. And those commissions regulate electric, gas, water, and telecom utilities. So I'll go ahead and start today. We're going to focus on the electric system, and we're going to kind of do that first through the lens of California and their events during the summer of 2020. There have been plenty of papers and articles that came out after that event, but I co-authored one with a slightly different take. I'm going to start by reviewing that, and I know New Jersey, is the focus of this conference, but I think we can kind of look at the situation in California and apply some of the lessons learned to any state that is interested in some policy design to foster sort of a resource mix transformation that can balance decarbonization goals, but also maintain system reliability. So from there, I'm going to discuss the kind of changes we're seeing on the system throughout the country. And these changes are really primarily being driven by state mandated renewable portfolio standards. Then we'll look at some of the more robust approaches and metrics that can sort of paint a more accurate picture of the associated risks that are introduced when you increase the variability on the system. And these tools can help policymakers and regulators to design decarbonization policies that maintain a level of reliability that is commensurate to the resources on the system. And policies designed with consideration for these risks can really help ensure that there are not only enough resources, but the right kind of resources, so that cases of firm load shedding like what we saw in California can be minimized in other states. So let's look at California's reliability challenges. We're not going to get too much into the details here of what happened in August of 2020. I'm sure many of you are familiar to some degree, but I do want to highlight that these events were at least partially the result of 2 decades of very ambitious decarbonization policies that led to the retiring of a lot of dispatchable and responsive generation. So, earlier this year, the California Commission, the CAISO, and the CEC all collaborated, and they developed a thorough root cause analysis. And the report basically identified these 3 primary factors that contributed to 2 curtailment events during that summer. I think today, I'll focus more on 1 and 2, and those are particularly relevant for setting the stage. The first is that the planning reserve margin targets were not adjusted appropriately over the past 2 decades to reflect characteristics and reliability attributes of the resources that were added to the system over the last 2 decades. And the second factor kind of builds on the first, and that's just recognizing that there were insufficient resources to address demand in the early evening hours. I think we're all somewhat familiar with the duck curve, but when you have a regional heat wave, it kind of pushed these existing operational challenges to a point where there simply were not enough responsive resources available. And as a result, the lights went out for hundreds of thousands of customers during 2 days in August. If you haven't already, I encourage you all to take a look at the report. A lot of really good information there that can be useful for New Jersey and for other states throughout the country. One longer term cause that isn't mentioned in the report is, again, that the state legislature in California, I don't think really fully understood the long-term impacts of increasingly stringent policies. So there's always a lag time for when a policy goes into effect and then when that actual impact is recognized and realized on the grid. And California legislators, they had great success with their initial RPS in the early 2000s. Utilities were rapidly adding renewables, and there were no major problems on the system. And that kind of reinforced that notion that the bar could be raised with more ambitious decarbonization requirements without compromising grid reliability. But again, during the past 20 years, there were many other things that were unfolding here. You had the implementation of other decarbonization policies. You had like the phase out of the once-through cooling towers along the coast. And California's market design was also evolving and growing in complexity. And of course, we can't ignore the incredible changes on the distribution side of the system with the deployment of rooftop solar. And that really complicated the load forecasting practices. But with all these moving pieces, system planners and operators really had a tough time sort of managing these in August of 2020. And of course, when the system is under extreme stress, as it was during that heat wave, that just ended up exacerbating existing problems. So we'll move on here. I just want to highlight one excerpt from the joint report, and that is that these changes in the resource mix and the timing of the net peak have increased the challenge of maintaining system reliability, and therefore additional work is needed to ensure sufficient resources are available to serve load during the net peak period and other potential periods of system strain. So I think this point really drives it home from that root cause analysis. We're going to talk next about the changing nature of the system throughout other parts of the country. So a new resource mix and new resources, relatively new, like wind and solar and battery storage, have different operational attributes. And most notably, they are not, at least wind and solar are not fully dispatchable and controllable by the system operator. And there are also ongoing changes on the load side with the deployment of new technologies and demand side programs. So, you have a rapidly changing system that simply requires new approaches for measuring and evaluating resource adequacy, especially as you look, 10 and 20 years out into the future. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of factors that are contributing to ongoing changes in the types of resources being added and removed from the system. Economics is a big one. You have cheap natural gas, of course, has led to that type of resource being the sort of number one capacity addition for many years. And then coal and nuclear have been sort of less economically viable. But from the policy side, the Clean Power Plan was ultimately repealed. And in the absence of some national energy plan that prioritizes decarbonization, we're sort of left with the renewable portfolio standards. And that's really sort of driving resource procurement decisions at the state level. You can see 6 states in the Western Interconnection passed RPS goals to make their in-state electricity carbon-free between 2040 and 2050. And then on the Eastern Interconnection, you have 5 states and the District of Columbia that have lower targets, but Vermont, New York, and then New Jersey all aim to have at least half of their resources as carbon-free by 2032. So, it'll be crucial for states, and I think this is a point that's kind of been missed here. It's just very important for states across regions to avoid situations where overlapping policies could create shortages. So, for example, you might have New Mexico with their RPS that leads to a retirement of a resource or a power plant that Nevada depends on for imports. So state RPS goals, as they're updated, they need to do this in a coordinated manner with neighboring states to avoid that kind of situation. This may be particularly relevant in New Jersey. It imported about 8% of its power in 2018. And that's the latest data I could find. But New Jersey is also part of PJM, so that kind of helps in terms of you already have a platform for coordinated regional planning. But New Jersey also heavily relies on nuclear and natural gas. Makes up almost 94% of their resources. So that's actually a pretty reliable mix because nuclear provides that base load, and then the natural gas provides that flexibility as you're introducing more variability on the system from wind and solar. But that kind of brings me to the next point here, and that's if you zoom out and look at the whole country, we can't ignore the importance of dispatchable resources. And until we have large scale, sort of long duration storage that's been deployed appropriately and at adequate levels, system reliability is still very dependent on controllable generation. So that's really how the nature of the system is changing. This figure shows the projected loss of dispatchable resources over the next 2 decades. This data was put together by SSR. They're a research firm, and they used EIA data and some assumptions. But according to their analysis, 300 gigawatts of dispatchable capacity is going to be taken out of service by 2030, and then 300 more by 2035, and by 2040. Almost 3/4 of all dispatchable capacity we have today is going to be gone. So you can see how most of the dispatchable resources in the country are going to be taken out of service before those RPS targets, particularly on the West Coast. And all this dispatchable capacity, it's generally, coal, oil, and natural gas. And I understand that nuclear is not exactly highly dispatchable, but the baseload, as I mentioned, the baseload characteristics are also important for system reliability. So, let's just look back to California and what might happen in an area that has lost enough levels of dispatchable resources. And on August 14th, that's sort of what happened here. You had natural gas, which was performing quite well before load was shed. It was accounting for something like over half of all generation. And then on the other hand, you look at a day in April 24th of this year, you can see the CAISO served 94.5% of the overall system load. So you can see the difference between when you have an extreme kind of heat wave versus a day in the spring. The lesson here is that it's not just about having enough resources, but it's about having the right resources to address variability and load patterns and even extreme weather events, because really the tolerance for firm load shed is declining as our society is more dependent on electricity. This is kind of just driving home what I've been talking about with the changing nature of the system. You're sort of losing the controllability and dispatchability overall. You have operational experience, which is it's declining in terms of, and when I say operational experience, I mean with these new technologies, there is a learning curve for system operators to sort of manage batteries. They're relatively a new technology. The predictability of fuel supply is declining. You have less centralized generation. And then on the forecasting side, the predictability and seasonal load patterns are, they're just simply harder to predict. And then trending up, you have increased load forecast complexity. You have different rate structures. The level of customer interaction with their utility is increasing. You're more dependent on transmission. And then, distributed generation is certainly growing as you have behind the meter and sort of the customer side installing batteries and sort of small scale storage. And then, of course, demand response programs are growing as well. So what do we do about all this? First, I'm not telling you anything new here, but as you add more wind and solar, the variability and forecast error, along with the performance of these resources, there's just less certainty. And we know that with high levels of wind and solar, system operators are going to be dealing with that. And the short-term forecasting, it is continually improving, but there's still a large range of potential outcomes from these resources compared to fully controllable and fully dispatchable generation. And this complicates the traditional resource adequacy approach because the basic reserve margin analysis was introduced during a time when load was more predictable and resources were fully controllable. So system planners, when you look at the toolbox here, it was really the deterministic approach. And that involved just basically doing a load forecast and then counting up all the generators and figuring out how much additional capacity would be needed over the next generally 10-year period. Deterministic projections were pretty straightforward. The industry is comfortable with it. It was used for over 100 years. And we've been trying to maintain the simplicity of this metric and sort of keep using it, but the inputs have just become far more complicated and complex. So ultimately, systems with higher levels of variability are going to need to rely and sort of shift to more probabilistic metrics and scenarios. And really, these scenarios should take a look at the extreme circumstances and conditions on the system. Probabilistic studies can certainly supplement the deterministic reserve margin, and they're really going to offer a better understanding of the system risks, particularly expected unserved energy or EUE. It's especially useful for looking at those pinch points during an upcoming season of when you might run into problems on the system where there's just more load than resources available. So overall, the approach is shifting away at looking at just how much capacity you have, and instead looking at the sort of energy side of it and how much in terms of hourly modeling to determine how much you're going to have. But the system operators, they can't make the wind blow faster. They can't make the sun shine when it's cloudy. So these are just essentially resource limitations. And it's worth noting every single energy source does have fuel limitations. Coal piles might freeze. The flow in the natural gas pipelines can be disrupted. But these events are rare, and the variability of wind and solar are just inherent to those resource types. Similarly, batteries have some limitations. Even the best technology is only going to have a runtime of 4 to 8 hours. And then you have market design issues. In California specifically, they're working on sort of a market design and market products to ensure that the batteries are charging and discharging based on price signals, but also based on immediate reliability needs. Demand response is a great tool, but then you also have contractual limitations. In many cases, you can only call on these resources so many times per season. And of course, there's also that delay that you can get when the system operator makes the phone call or pushes the button to when the load reduction is actually realized. Finally, imports from neighboring areas can be an issue. In RTOs like PJM, it's not as big of a concern, but congestion can definitely limit import capability. And we actually saw that in California during their event. So even though there are limitations, planners and operators do have a lot of tools, and there's new tools that are being introduced more recently to help navigate this sort of the new landscape. First, it's going to be important to ensure that there are enough dispatchable resources to counter the variability and maintain system balancing and stability. So the first step is to avoid retirements of certain resources until adequate replacement resources have been identified. And that includes battery storage, of course. And it's not just important the type of resources, but where they are on the system. You have to consider transmission constraints. In ISO RTO areas, as I mentioned, the appropriate market design can help create proper price signals and address resource limitations. And they've been doing this in California for many years with their flexible ramping product. And what this does is it kind of allows the market to account for that short-term variability and recognize the upcoming ramping needs in the next 5 minutes, 15 minutes, or hour ahead to kind of ensure and secure responsive resources. And this is done again through price signals. And these tools are effective, but there are limitations as the system approaches even higher levels of resources. Planning the system over larger geographic regions can help as well in terms of improved reliability. And finally, it's important to assess areas under worst case scenarios. And that means, perhaps assuming that those imports are not going to be available. When you have something like a regional heat wave, as we saw in California and really most of the Western interconnection, you can't always rely on imports from the neighboring areas. So I want to take a little bit of time next to talk briefly about essential reliability services. For those of you who are familiar, this was a concept that was formalized by NARUC about 5 years ago. And I think it's really important and it's going to continue to be relevant for policymakers to recognize that different resources do provide varying levels of frequency response and voltage support, inertia, and ramping. So frequency response, basically it's the ability of a resource to withstand the loss on the system and kind of recover. Similarly, and by the way, wind and solar can provide some of these attributes, including inertia. Ramping is a little different. When the sun sets and the photovoltaic output declines, other resources kind of need to fill that void. So, ultimately, it's critical that areas have enough ERS to maintain system reliability as more renewables are added to the system. One other way that resource adequacy projections can be improved is by looking at past events and performance of the system and kind of incorporating that into projections. So just to move towards the end here, the following approaches can supplement traditional resource adequacy assessments. I mentioned earlier the importance of probabilistic metrics. You can introduce probabilistic scenarios and again, examine those high risk periods. And then developing more robust modeling, looking again at energy instead of capacity. Addressing a more granular geographic footprint. So that would mean sort of zooming in, looking at areas where there's congestion, and then also assessing a more granular time period, which means doing an assessment over a specific month or a season instead of the whole year. And then finally, tracking levels of essential reliability services. Ultimately, the future of system planning is going to involve more advanced tools, and these tools are going to help identify those reliability risks and offer adequate time for operators to secure the appropriate resources, and really market design can help with that. Continued improvements of tools that more accurately forecast variable resources and load, and those are underway, and they're getting better all the time. And then improving the wind and solar forecasts, the day ahead and the short term. And then finally, there's going to likely be a growing reliance on the ancillary services market to address balancing and stability. I'm going to finish up here with this graphic. I think, I want to really drive home the importance of incorporating some sort of a risk assessment into a policy design. Nothing I've said today is intended to suggest decarbonization and system reliability are opposing forces. I think that'd be an oversimplification, but policies do need to be crafted with appropriate flexibility and consideration for other factors. So one way to do this would be to ensure decarbonization policies are informed by risk assessments and scenarios that paint a clear picture of the potential impacts on the system. Another is to ensure decarbonization requirements have some flexibility and some sort of connection to the resource adequacy that changes on really a daily basis. This graphic shows how policy at the legislative level sort of looking at renewable portfolio standards could be designed with some flexibility to allow state commissions or even the system operator to provide periodic assessments to determine how the resource changes as a result of these policies are impacting the reliability of the system. So in this graphic, you can see state legislatures could implement an RPS policy, but as resources are retired and carbon-free resources reach higher levels, there would be periodic assessments to examine the impacts and then project what might happen if the trend continues. And this would likely involve some changes to the integrated resource planning processes that are currently sort of underway. And it might call for some adjustments to the compliance with state renewable portfolio standards if an assessment revealed potential risks to short-term or mid-term system reliability. I understand this is happening already to some degree, but there's not really a solid feedback loop from where the policy goes into effect, and then there would be some allowance for modification to that policy if system resource adequacy or reliability is at risk. So I'll close there, and I'll look forward to any questions. I'm leaving you all with some additional resources that you might be interested in, and I'll leave it there. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk to you all today.
Before I open it up to the floor for some questions, I just have a couple quick ones myself. You and your colleagues, obviously deal with boards of public utilities or regulators, throughout the nation, and obviously with the major utilities. Is the lessons from California and the policies that you've laid out to ensure reliability being heard and beginning to be implemented on a national basis? Or do you think that we may be moving too fast without taking reliability into significant or necessary consideration?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think what's nice is, you have states like Texas and California and others that are kind of serving as something like a laboratory. California has certainly done a tremendous job overall in adding wind and solar, and Texas has more wind than any other state in the country. And you can kind of look at those examples and see where things have gone well and see where things could be adjusted. When you look at California, I think I kind of mentioned one of the challenges is that I think most recently in 2018, SB 100, that state policy was passed by the governor and by their Senate, and that sort of took it to the next level. And again, you still have this. It's a slow-moving ship when you talk about the changing the resources on the system and the impacts associated with that. And again, when you hit that summer of 2020, those were the result of policies that went into effect many years ago. So you had a resource mix, then you're stuck with it. You can't make policy on a short-term basis. So the system operators kind of stuck trying to manage what they have. And, I think certain practices in California, you have reliability must run units and other short-term capacity procurement mechanisms. Those can be useful, and they did do that before the summer of 2020, and they did it again before this summer. They did a lot, really quite a lot, to avoid any kind of issues in 2021. So, I think one of the things that other states can learn is, if you're going to do these ambitious policies, you got to make sure you have some sort of a backstop and some sort of a backup to address when things get tight. One of the things Germany does is they mothballed a lot of their resources, and this was mainly coal resources, but they're able to bring them back on in relatively short-term manner to address shortages. If they see that there's going to be some issues, they can restaff and re-up those units and have them available all the transmissions there. They don't want to do that. Their policies are, in terms of decarbonization, are very, very tight and strict and ambitious. But again, they also don't want to sacrifice reliability. So I think looking at those examples for certain states can be useful. So yeah.
And just one more quick question, just to follow up on that, and this is really a California question. Given their experience, in 2020, given everything you've said, why are they closing Diablo Canyon?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to that directly. I think that they're losing their last nuclear unit, it's a big challenge. I could go back to that chart I showed earlier that, you saw 2,100 megawatts, I think, was nuclear during that August event. So you look into the future and you subtract that without again identifying appropriate resources to replace it. That's a huge baseload resource that's going to cause, I think, some challenges there. We'll see what happens. I think it's 2025 when it is going to be taken out of service, but yeah, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because again, I can't drive this home enough. It's, the replacement capacity has to be online and sort of tested before you take other stuff out of service. And I think, if you look at the natural gas resources that were taken out of service really in 2018 and 19, had those been available, it's possible California wouldn't have had an issue. So, and a lot of that's economics. You can't just keep these resources on sitting there idle. That's just not going to probably work from an economic side of it. But again, that's where the the sort of trade-off has to be made here. You want mechanisms to keep those resources available when needed, or if they're going to disappear and retire permanently, then you're going to face some risks. So,
any questions from the audience? One is coming from across the room. And if you could state your name and the company you're with.
Hi, I'm Marty Rothfelder with Rothfelder Stern LLC, a law firm that focuses on energy and telecommunications in Trenton. So the one item on your slide that surprised me a bit was you indicated a higher forthcoming reliance on transmission than today. Certainly in New Jersey, there's going to be a lot of investment in transmission to get the ocean wind generation on land to where it's used. But in a world where there's supposedly going to be more distributed energy resources rather than large central power plants, I would have thought, perhaps erroneously, that there'd be somewhat less or at least equal reliance on transmission. So I wondered if there are some components that I'm missing or misunderstanding that makes you conclude we're going to be more reliant on transmission than today.
yeah, that's a good question. I think I caught most of that. It really depends on how much is going to be added on the distribution side, and that's sort of gonna be tough to predict precisely. But I think the idea is if you're setting renewable portfolio standards and you're primarily adding wind and utility scale solar, then indeed, yes, transmission is going to be needed to get those resources to the load pockets. If if you're going to add this on the distributed side, that can obviously be one way to meet an RPS as well. But it's at this point, it's just unclear, I think, and it's really going to depend on each state's policy. Part of the reason why I could say that's one of the upsides of a sort of a national approach is that it kind of creates a better general idea of how you're going to meet decarbonization goals. So I'll kind of leave it there. I know that's not a complete answer, and maybe I can follow up with you with a more detailed response. But yeah, ultimately, I think it just depends on at this point on each state and what, how they're going to achieve their individual RPS targets.
Elliott, we thank you for being here today and for that presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.